They conquered our world without firing a single shot, but their greatest mistake was assuming our silence meant surrender. The Kailari arrived in ships of dark, polished stone, descending from the clouds to impose a new, utterly silent order upon Earth. They are a species of chilling efficiency and cold logic, standing 7 feet tall, clad in naturally grown crystalline armor. They do not possess vocal cords or auditory canals. They are completely and entirely deaf. To them, the universe is a canvas of light and vibration, and they communicate through intricate flashes of bioluminescence and deep, subsonic tremors felt solely through the ground. When they analyzed humanity, the Kailari saw only weakness. We were frail, squishy, completely disorganized, and driven by irrational emotions. They dismantled our militaries not with violence, but with advanced dampening fields that rendered every explosive, every engine, and every firearm utterly inert. In mere days, they stripped the planet of its defenses and its sovereignty. Earth was swiftly reorganized into a vast mining colony. Humans were reassigned as menial laborers, forced to toil in the shadows of the massive, sleek resource extraction spires that now pierced the smog-choked skies of every major city. The alien overlords banned anything that produced high-frequency vibrations, perceiving our machines and our art as nothing more than chaotic, useless atmospheric disturbances. They believed they had scrubbed every last dangerous artifact from the ruins of old Chicago, completely unaware of a sealed, buried vault that held the key to their undoing. Deep within the subterranean labyrinth of Sector 4, Elias wiped a streak of dark grease from his forehead and stared at a pile of salvaged wiring. He was officially registered as a Class 2 mechanic, tasked with repairing the Kailari ore transports that hovered silently through the ruined streets. Unofficially, he was a hoarder of ghosts. He spent his nights in a hidden makeshift workshop carved into an abandoned maintenance shaft, meticulously repairing banned pre-invasion technology. Old toasters, dead smartphones, digital watches, anything that reminded him that humanity once had a pulse. A heavy metal door groaned open, and Maya slipped into the dim light of his workshop, dropping a heavy canvas satchel onto his workbench. Maya was a courier for the fractured remnants of the human resistance, navigating the dangerous, collapsed subway lines to deliver encrypted messages. She moved with a sharp, kinetic energy, her eyes always scanning the shadows. There was a quiet, electric tension between them, a bond forged in stolen moments and the shared, unspoken danger of their double lives. She leaned against the workbench, offering a wry, tired smile. She teased him about his collection of useless trash, but he could see the genuine affection in her eyes. Elias admired her reckless bravery, the way she refused to let the crushing weight of the Kailari occupation extinguish her spirit. Maya leaned in close, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. She told him about a newly collapsed transit tunnel deep beneath the city's old entertainment district. She had squeezed through a fissure in the concrete to hide from a Kailari patrol and stumbled into a cavernous, untouched space. It was shielded by thick lead lining and dense bedrock, rendering it completely invisible to the alien biosensors. She said she found machines down there, massive ones, unlike anything she had seen in the salvage yards. Elias did not hesitate. He packed a bag of tools, grabbed a stolen luminescent flare, and followed Maya into the absolute darkness of the underground. The descent took hours, twisting through the crushed metal guts of the old city. When they finally reached the fissure, Elias squeezed through the jagged concrete and held up his light. The beam cut through decades of dust to reveal an immaculate, preserved underground music venue. It was a cathedral of forgotten sound. Arranged on a wide stage were towering black monoliths, a massive professional-grade concert speaker system, flanked by heavy industrial amplifiers. Elias felt his heart hammer against his ribs. He approached a soundboard covered in a thick layer of gray dust. Beneath it, secured in a shock-proof casing, was a heavy-duty digital archive drive, a master server. It was an entire library of human expression, locked away in the dark. Working feverishly, Elias managed to detach one of the smaller portable amplifier units and the archive drive. It took all their combined strength to haul the heavy equipment back up through the perilous tunnel system, dodging a pair of silent Kailari overseers along the way. Back in the safety of his workshop, Elias set the equipment on his bench. The air was thick with anticipation. He wired the amplifier to a stolen high-capacity Kailari power cell. Maya stood a few feet away, her arms crossed, watching him with a mixture of profound skepticism and burning curiosity. He connected the archive drive. He did not know what was stored on it. He found a pair of frayed, antique studio headphones in his collection and carefully spliced the wires into the amplifier's massive output jack. He intended to test the system quietly, to just see if the digital files had survived the years of decay. His fingers hovered over the rusted volume dial. He meant to keep it at 0. He twisted it the wrong way. Elias hit the play button on the console. Instead of a faint, contained whisper of audio, the system bypassed the frayed headphones entirely and routed the signal straight through the amplifier's main cone. A colossal concussive wave of raw, heavily distorted electric guitar and a punishing, rapid-fire double-kick drum blasted into the small, concrete room. The physical force of the sound hit Elias in the chest like a physical blow. The air itself seemed to turn into a solid, vibrating mass. Dust rained violently from the ceiling. Maya clamped her hands over her ears, her eyes wide with absolute shock. Outside the workshop, in the main corridor, a Kailari security drone was silently gliding past the ventilation grate. The drone was a sleek, floating sphere of crystalline armor, kept aloft by delicate internal gyroscopes that manipulated subsonic gravity waves. The intense, aggressive, high-frequency sound waves tore through the grate and slammed into the alien machine. The heavy, relentless bass and the shrieking guitar frequencies struck the precise resonant pitch of the drone's internal dampeners. The drone violently jerked to a halt. The crystalline components inside its spherical shell began to vibrate with terrifying speed. Within seconds, the drone could not handle the sensory overload. The internal mechanism shattered. The drone dropped from the air like a stone and exploded into a shower of white-hot sparks and fractured, pale crystal. Inside the workshop, Elias desperately slammed his hand onto the power switch, killing the music. The sudden silence that followed was deafening, save for the faint crackle of burning alien circuitry out in the hallway. Elias and Maya slowly lowered their hands from their ears. They walked to the ventilation grate and peered out. The invincible, highly advanced Kailari security drone was nothing but a smoking pile of debris on the floor. Maya looked from the wreckage back to the ancient, rusted amplifier sitting on the workbench. A slow, dangerous smile crept across her face. Elias stared at his own hands, his mind racing to comprehend the sheer absurdity of what had just happened. The most advanced, logical, and ruthlessly efficient alien species in the galaxy had just been taken down by a heavy rock intro. They realized in that instant that humanity was not disarmed at all. They had just forgotten how to pull the trigger. The shattered remains of the Kailari drone lay spread across the rusted steel table, a pile of fractured crystal that represented the single greatest threat to the alien occupation. It was a handful of broken glass that would soon crack an empire. Elias and Maya had meticulously gathered every razor-sharp fragment of the ruined machine, packing it alongside the heavy amplifier and the digital archive drive. Moving with practiced stealth, they descended deeper into the subterranean ruins of the city, navigating a lightless maze of flooded maintenance shafts and collapsed storm drains to reach the hidden heart of the human resistance. The Resistance Enclave was a sprawling subterranean shanty town built within a massive, hollowed-out subterranean water reservoir. It was a place of perpetual twilight, illuminated by the harsh, flickering glare of scavenged sodium lamps and the soft orange glow of improvised heating coils. Maya led Elias through the cramped walkways, ignoring the skeptical glances of armed sentries, until they reached the command bunker. Inside, a grizzled former structural engineer named Thorne reviewed supply manifests by the light of a dying glowstick. He was the de facto leader of Sector 4, a man worn thin by years of whispering in the dark. Elias did not offer a preamble. He simply dumped the bag of pulverized Kalari drone parts onto Thorne's desk and set the amplifier down beside it. He explained what had happened in the maintenance shaft, detailing the exact moment the heavy rock track hit the drone. Thorne listened with a deep furrow in his brow, his initial disbelief warring with the undeniable physical evidence sitting before him. The Resistance had spent years trying to crack Kalari armor with salvaged mining lasers and thermite, only to leave scorch marks. Elias was claiming he had destroyed a high-tier security unit with a guitar riff. To prove it, Thorne ordered his technicians to haul in a captured, fully operational Kalari sensory node. It was a floating, melon-sized sphere of geometric crystal, constantly shifting and pulsing with a cool blue bioluminescence as it scanned the room for unauthorized vibrations. They secured the alien device inside a reinforced plasteel testing chamber, thick enough to muffle explosions, and Elias rigged the amplifier to face the glass. The underground command center held its collective breath as Elias accessed the digital archive drive. He needed to understand the mechanics of this impossible weapon. The Resistance technicians initiated a series of controlled experiments, logging the alien technology's reaction to different acoustic frequencies. Elias started gently, selecting a sweeping, complex classical symphony by Beethoven. As the swelling strings and disciplined orchestration pumped into the chamber, the sensory node stopped its smooth patrol. Its soothing blue glow mutated into an irritated, sickly yellow. The sphere hovered in place, trembling slightly as if annoyed by a persistent insect, its internal processors clearly confused by the structured, cascading frequencies. But its armor held firm. Next, Maya suggested they try something less predictable. Elias selected an aggressive mid-century jazz track, heavy on syncopated rhythms and frantic brass solos. The result was instantaneous and incredibly strange. The Kalari sensor node lost all spatial awareness. It began to bounce erratically against the walls of the plasteel chamber, spinning like a drunken top. Its anti-gravity gyros stuttered and misfired in desperate attempts to compensate for the wildly shifting time signatures. Several Resistance fighters let out quiet barks of laughter, a sound rarely heard in the dark, as the pinnacle of alien engineering completely lost its mechanical mind to a saxophone solo. But annoyance and confusion were not lethal. Elias needed to replicate the destruction of the drone. He scrolled through the archive and queued up a playlist of heavy metal and aggressively mixed, bass-heavy hip-hop. He warned everyone to step back and cranked the rusted volume dial. A relentless, punishing wall of down-tuned guitars, blast-beat drums, and floor-shaking sub-bass slammed into the testing chamber. The effect was catastrophic. The alien sensory node froze mid-air. Its yellow glow flared into a blinding, agonizing white. The intense, aggressive, low-frequency sound waves and rapid tempos were striking the exact, fatal resonant pitch of the Kailari's crystalline structure. The alien technology was essentially an advanced tuning fork, and Elias had just struck the chord that tore it apart. The sphere began to vibrate with terrifying, violent speed until it simply could not contain the kinetic energy. It imploded, sending a shower of fine, glittering dust cascading to the floor of the chamber. Thorne stared at the dust, his eyes wide. Elias and Maya exchanged a look of pure, adrenaline-fueled triumph. They had not just found a weapon. They had discovered a fundamental, fatal flaw in the biology and technology of their oppressors. The Kailari were entirely unprepared for the sheer, aggressive force of human rhythm. Miles above the subterranean reservoir, far removed from the dirt and the desperation of the resistance, the central spire pierced the stratosphere. It was a monument to Kailari dominance, a needle of obsidian and silver that hummed with silent, immense power. Inside the spire's primary observation deck, Overseer Valen stood motionless, gazing down at the smog-covered sprawl of Sector 4. Valen was a terrifying figure, even among his own kind. His crystalline armor was a dark, polished amethyst, marking his high rank within the political and security echelons of the occupation. He did not operate on malice. He operated on pure, frictionless logic. He viewed the human workforce not as a conquered people, but as a biological resource, a flawed but necessary gear in the great machine of planetary extraction. Currently, that machine was malfunctioning. Valen turned away from the observation window and approached a vast, floating holographic display. The room was entirely silent, save for the faint subsonic thrum of the spire's gravity engines. A vibration Valen felt pleasantly through the soles of his feet. His skin rippled with rapid, complex flashes of deep violet light, interfacing directly with the spire's central intelligence matrix. He was reviewing the daily efficiency reports from the lower levels. A pattern was emerging, one that defied statistical probability. In the past 48 hours, mineral extraction in Sector 4 had dropped by a fraction of a percent. Simultaneously, Valen noted 3 distinct unexplained gaps in the security patrol grid. Drones were missing. Furthermore, microscopic structural analyses of the transit tunnels indicated bizarre, localized stress fractures in the concrete, damage inconsistent with natural seismic activity or industrial machinery. The local Kailari subcommanders had dismissed these anomalies as the inevitable friction of operating a decaying planet. Valen knew better. He understood that when dealing with an irrational, emotional species like humanity, anomalies were never accidents. They were symptoms of a disease. Valen magnified a map of the subterranean transit lines, his mind running through millions of tactical permutations. The humans were hiding something. They were organizing in the dark, gathering resources that his sensors could not detect. He could not fathom what rudimentary tools they could possibly assemble to challenge Kailari supremacy. But he refused to leave a variable unchecked. He tapped a command sequence into the holographic interface, his bioluminescence flashing a harsh, authoritative crimson. He authorized a covert deployment of the Silent Hunters, a specialized cadre of Kailari enforcers designed for absolute stealth and lethal precision. They were to descend into the lower levels, bypass the standard patrol routes, and root out the source of the structural damage. They would find the disease, and they would excise it from the workforce permanently. Deep below, completely unaware of the elite strike force now hunting them. Elias wiped the sweat from his brow and looked at the archive drive. They knew how to kill a drone, but a single amplifier in a basement would not win a war. They needed more power. They needed to know what would happen when those frequencies hit the nervous system of a living, breathing Kailari soldier. And above all, they needed to find a way to make the whole world hear the music before the hunters found them in the dark. A single spark of paranoia in a flawlessly logical mind is all it takes to doom 8 billion souls. In the frictionless floating halls of the Kailari High Council, Overseer Valen had just decided that humanity had outlived its usefulness. The High Council chamber was a vast, spherical amphitheater suspended near the apex of the central spire, devoid of air currents and bathed in absolute silence. The 12 elders stood on hovering obsidian discs, their crystalline armor shifting through spectrums of cool blues and greens, engaging in a visual debate concerning planetary resource quotas. Valen's arrival disrupted the calm. His armor flared with an aggressive, pulsing crimson, demanding immediate attention. He projected his findings into the central holographic matrix, displaying the microscopic fractures in Sector 4, the sudden loss of telemetry from elite security drones, and an infinitesimal drop in mining efficiency. Valen argued that humans were inherently unstable. They were biological anomalies driven by volatile chemical reactions rather than pure logic, and their continued existence was a mathematical error. He proposed that maintaining the human workforce required more energy and risk than the extracted minerals were worth. With cold precision, he formally requested the activation of the Global Eradication Protocol, a synchronized orbital strike designed to sterilize the planet's surface of mammalian life, leaving the infrastructure and resources entirely intact. The elders processed the data in unison. Slowly, their armor shifted from neutral hues to the cold, decisive white of absolute agreement. The protocol was authorized, and the irreversible countdown was set for 48 hours. Deep within the Spire's archival vaults, an entirely different realization was unfolding. Ilara, a Kailari archivist tasked with cataloging and destroying the remnants of human culture, was in the process of committing high treason. Her crystalline plating was a soft, translucent azure, a physical manifestation of a mind prone to curiosity rather than rigid enforcement. Her mandate was to process captured data drives, ensuring no tactical information remained hidden within the primitive human networks. Instead, she had spent the last 2 years secretly absorbing human visual media. Without the ability to hear, Ilara experienced human cinema, documentaries, and home videos as pure, kinetic art. She watched faces contort in grief, erupt in joy, and twist in anger. She observed the strange, inefficient rituals of dance, the illogical sacrifices made for love, and the profound resilience of a species that refused to simply expire. She had come to understand that humanity was not a disease or a chaotic variable. It was a vibrant symphony of emotion that the Kailari were simply incapable of perceiving. When the eradication protocol flashed across her terminal, a deep, heavy dread settled into her chest. She watched the 48-hour countdown initiate and knew she had to intervene. Ilara possessed no combat training, but she controlled the Spire's lower-level maintenance network. She had spent months tracking the movements of the human resistance couriers through the city's ruined security cameras. Drawn to their defiant energy, she recognized the sharp, tactical movements of one courier in particular. Maya. Working swiftly, Ilara isolated Maya's projected route through the collapsed subway lines and set out into the dark. Maya was sprinting through a flooded service tunnel, her boots splashing through toxic water, when the emergency lighting grid ahead of her began to malfunction. The heavy halogen bulbs did not just flicker, they pulsed in a deliberate, repeating sequence. It was a visual pattern, a beckoning rhythm in a world of silence. Maya drew her scavenged plasma pistol, her heart hammering against her ribs, and followed the pulsing lights into an abandoned maintenance bay. Standing in the center of the room, towering 7 feet tall and radiating a nervous pale blue light, was a Kailari. Maya raised her weapon instantly, her finger tightening on the trigger. She had never been this close to one of the overlords without an execution squad present. The alien did not attack or summon reinforcements. Instead, Ilara slowly reached into her armored plating and withdrew a heavily modified human datapad. She slid it across the damp concrete floor. Maya kept her pistol aimed directly at the alien's chest as she cautiously picked up the device. The screen displayed a simple, terrifying message in stark English text. It detailed that Overseer Valen knew about the subterranean anomalies, that the High Council had authorized planetary sterilization, and that humanity had exactly 48 hours left to live. The final sentence read that Ilara wanted to help them survive. Maya stared at the towering alien, her mind struggling to process the impossible scenario. A Kailari dissident was offering them a chance at salvation. Ilara handed over a secondary data drive containing the Central Spire's patrol routes and the encrypted access codes to the lower broadcast hubs. It was a leap of faith across an evolutionary chasm. Maya nodded once. A silent pact forged in the shadows and bolted back toward the resistance bunker. Elias was elbow-deep in the rusted wiring of a secondary amplifier when Maya burst through the heavy steel bunker doors. She did not bother with greetings or protocol. She slammed the datapad and the data drive onto the workbench, shattering the quiet focus of the room. Thorn and the other resistance leaders gathered around as Maya quickly detailed her encounter with the rogue archivist. The room fell into a stunned, terrifying silence as they read the countdown. 48 hours until the sky caught fire. The minor victory of destroying a single security drone evaporated instantly. Elias stared at the ancient, heavy amplifier sitting on the table. It was a potent weapon, a genuine threat to the crystalline armor of their oppressors. But its range was limited to a single concrete room. He looked at Maya, seeing the exhaustion and the fierce, unyielding determination in her eyes. He reached out, his grease-stained hand briefly gripping hers, grounding himself in the quiet strength she always provided. The profound moral weight of their situation settled heavily on his shoulders. They had the means to fight back, to exploit the Kailari's fatal weakness to aggressive, low-frequency sound, but a localized attack would mean nothing if the orbital platforms fired. They needed to hit every Kailari on the planet simultaneously before the clock ran out. They realized they had to plug their archaic analog music system directly into the Central Spire's planetary communications network. It was an objective bordering on madness. It required scaling a heavily fortified alien tower, carrying hundreds of pounds of obsolete audio equipment, and hacking a planetary network built entirely on light and vibration. Elias grabbed a heavy wrench, his knuckles turning white. The political machinations of the High Council had forced their hand, turning a slow, methodical rebellion into a desperate, sprinting race against extinction. They had to build the loudest, most destructive sound system in human history in less than 2 days, while Valen mobilized his elite hunters in the dark above them. Every shadow in the subterranean tunnels now held the potential for death, and the silence of the Kailari occupation felt heavier than ever. A silent apocalypse demands a deafening response, but building a doomsday device out of concert speakers requires walking straight into the graveyard of human culture. The clock was bleeding away, leaving Elias and Maya with less than 40 hours to assemble an arsenal capable of shattering the crystalline bones of an empire. The human resistance, previously a fractured network of smugglers and saboteurs, was suddenly unified by the terrifying reality of the global eradication protocol. Thorn diverted every available able-bodied fighter to Elias. They transformed from a hidden militia into an army of scavengers, ascending from the deep subterranean reservoir into the highly restricted, decaying upper levels of Sector 4. Their target was the old entertainment district, a sprawling zone of shattered arenas, collapsed nightclubs, and ruined amphitheaters that the Kailari had long ago deemed devoid of useful industrial resources. Moving through the skeletal remains of the city was a masterclass in tension. The sky above was choked with the perpetual gray smog of alien atmospheric processors, casting a pallid, suffocating gloom over the rusted neon signs of a bygone era. Elias and Maya led the primary strike team, communicating entirely through sharp hand signals to avoid the hypersensitive sonic nodes dropped by Kailari patrols. They infiltrated a massive, partially collapsed stadium, its grandstands overgrown with pale, light-starved synthetic moss. Deep within the stadium's reinforced concrete bowels, they found their prize, untouched by the alien dampening fields. A cache of massive industrial-grade touring speakers and heavy-duty amplifiers sat dormant in heavily armored flight cases. It was a treasure trove of pure acoustic destruction. It took 20 men and women straining against thick nylon tow ropes to haul a single, monolithic subwoofer up the cracked concrete ramps. They worked with a desperate, frantic energy, muscles burning, driven by the knowledge that every second brought the orbital strike closer. However, assembling the physical speakers was only half the equation. Elias faced a monumental technical hurdle that threatened to unravel the entire operation. To broadcast the lethal frequencies across the globe, they could not just point the speakers at the central spire. They had to physically breach the spire's heavily guarded broadcast hub and splice the analog human audio feed directly into the Kailari planetary communications network. It was a system built entirely on complex bioluminescence and subsonic ground-penetrating radar. Elias had to figure out how to force a raw, chaotic wave of heavy metal through an alien router designed for pure, frictionless light, without vaporizing the entire system in the process. To even attempt that kind of catastrophic data conversion, they needed power. Human generators were too loud, too dirty, and far too weak. They required military-grade Kailari energy cells, the kind strictly guarded in upper-level supply depots. The resistance had to launch a brazen raid right under the noses of their executioners. The target was a sleek, obsidian-plated logistics hub suspended above the ruined highway interchange, bristling with automated defense turrets and patrolling security drones. Maya took point, her movements a fluid dance of lethal precision. She utilized the encrypted patrol routes Ilara had provided, guiding the strike team through the blind spots in the Kailari sensor grid. They breached the facility's lower loading bay, slicing through the reinforced crystal locks with a scavenged thermal lance. Inside, the air was cold and smelled of ozone. Racks of glowing, pale blue energy cells lined the walls, humming with immense, silent power. Elias and the team moved quickly, loading the heavy, volatile cylinders into insulated carrying harnesses. It was going perfectly. Then, the shadows moved. Valen's elite silent hunters had bypassed the standard security protocols, operating entirely off the grid. They dropped from the vaulted ceiling of the loading bay with terrifying speed, their pitch-black crystalline armor absorbing the ambient light. They carried no ranged weapons, relying instead on long, vibrating kinetic blades that sliced through human armor like wet paper. The ambush was absolute and devastating. The loading bay erupted into a chaotic, silent slaughter. The resistance fighters fired their magnetic rifles, but the archaic projectiles simply shattered against the hunters' specialized plating. Maya fired her plasma pistol, the searing bolt illuminating the dark room for a split second, taking down one of the assassins, but 3 more instantly took its place. Elias had the primary harness loaded with the energy cells. He was the most important person in the room. Maya knew it. She looked at him across the vast, bloody expanse of the loading bay. There was no fear in her eyes, only a fierce, blazing resolve, a silent communication of a love too deep for words and a duty too heavy to ignore. She shouted at him to run, her voice a jarring, beautiful sound cutting through the deadly silence of the Kailari ambush. Maya deliberately drew the attention of the remaining hunters, stepping out from behind cover and firing a continuous, blinding stream of plasma suppression fire down the main corridor. She was intentionally collapsing the reinforced archway above her, sealing the hunters inside the bay with her and cutting off their pursuit of the energy cells. Elias hesitated for a fraction of a second, his heart tearing in two. He wanted to charge back, to fight and die beside her. But the heavy weight of the energy cells strapped to his back anchored him to reality. The survival of the entire human race rested on his shoulders. With a strangled cry of raw agony, Elias turned and sprinted toward the extraction point, the heavy steel blast doors slamming shut behind him. plunging Maya into the dark with the deadliest killers on the planet. The escape back to the subterranean reservoir was a blur of exhausting, soul-crushing motion. When Elias finally stumbled through the bunker doors, dropping the glowing Kailari power cells onto the central planning table, he was entirely hollow. He collapsed against the cold concrete wall, the adrenaline leaving him in a rushing tide, replaced by a profound, suffocating grief. Thorn and the surviving fighters looked at the door, waiting for Maya to walk through. When she did not, a heavy, mournful silence fell over the room. The cost of their rebellion had suddenly become agonizingly real. Elias stared at his calloused hands, hands that had built useless trinkets in the dark, hands that had failed to hold on to the woman he loved. The urge to surrender, to let the orbital fire wash away the pain, was overwhelmingly seductive. Yet, as he looked up at the bruised, exhausted faces of the men and women who had just sacrificed everything to bring him those power cells, a profound realization took root in his chest. Humanity was frail. Yes, they were emotional, irrational, and deeply flawed. But the Kailari could never comprehend the sheer, terrifying power of a broken heart. Maya had not died in vain. She had given them a chance. Her sacrifice was not a tactical loss, but a violent spark of unity. True strength did not lie in indestructible crystal armor or cold, calculating logic. It lived in the willingness to bleed for the person next to you, to surrender your own future so that millions of others might have one. Elias stood up, his grief hardening into a weapon far sharper than any alien blade. He looked at the massive stacks of scavenged concert speakers, the archaic amplifiers, and the glowing Kailari power cells. They had everything they needed. He began to issue orders, his voice steady, stripped of all hesitation. They were going to march into the very heart of the alien empire, and they were going to make them listen to the song of human defiance. The central spire was waiting, and the silence was about to be broken. Vengeance is a heavy burden, but it weighs exponentially more when strapped to your spine in the form of 400 pounds of weaponized analog sound equipment. Elias was about to deliver a sonic payload that would either shatter an empire or become the loudest epitaph in human history. He stood at the base of the central spire, breathing hard beneath the crushing weight of a custom-built exoskeleton speaker rig. Thick, insulated cables, heavy as pythons, wrapped around his torso, connecting a dual array of industrial subwoofers to a pair of overcharged Kailari power cells humming violently at his hips. The massive frame groaned with every step, a rusted, jagged defiance of the spire's frictionless obsidian perfection. Behind him, a hand-picked strike team of 20 resistance fighters gripped their archaic magnetic rifles, their faces painted with grease and grim resolve. They were ghosts stepping into the house of gods. The infiltration began not with a physical breach, but with a digital apparition. High above them, in the spire's archival vaults, Ilara sat before a massive holographic interface. Her azure crystalline armor pulsed with a rapid, terrified rhythm. She was actively overriding the spire's primary security protocols, feeding localized blackout loops into the central intelligence matrix. As Elias and his team approached the heavily fortified ground-level loading locks, the colossal obsidian blast doors simply slid open in absolute silence. Ilara was painting a safe path through a labyrinth of light and vibration, masking their heavy, clumsy footsteps from the hypersensitive floor nodes. She watched their thermal signatures move through the corridors, profoundly moved by their reckless charge into certain death. While Elias climbed higher into the alien fortress, Maya was suspended in a cold, frictionless stasis field near the spire's apex. She was bruised, bleeding from a deep cut above her eye, and completely immobilized. Overseer Valen stood before her, his amethyst armor radiating a harsh, interrogative crimson, because he lacked vocal cords. Valen utilized a localized holographic projection field, translating his neural queries into stark, floating English text right in front of Maya's face. The text hovered with clinical precision. Specify the nature of the subterranean structural anomalies. Detail the chemical composition of your explosive devices. Maya spat a glob of blood onto the pristine, glowing floor of the interrogation chamber. She offered Valen a wide, utterly exhausted grin. She told the text prompt that the structural anomalies were just a severe termite problem, and that their secret weapon was a highly volatile recipe for deep-fried butter. Valen's optical sensors narrowed. His internal processors attempted to cross-reference her statements with known biological and chemical threats. The translation matrix fractured, trying to parse the concept of weaponized dairy. The holographic text updated rapidly, demanding clarity, stating that her heart rate indicated no chemical enhancement, yet her responses lacked any tactical logic. Maya laughed, a harsh, scraping sound that Valen could not hear but felt as a chaotic vibration against his armor. She told him that was the whole point, that his entire species was nothing but a bunch of glorified chandeliers with zero sense of irony. She leaned into the stasis field, her eyes burning with defiance, and informed him that they could map every star in the galaxy but could not understand a simple joke. Valen found himself paralyzed by her sheer illogical obstinance. The Kailari interrogation techniques relied on inflicting pain to extract data. But Maya was using dark humor and human sarcasm as an impenetrable shield, entirely confusing a creature built entirely on empirical truth. Hundreds of floors below, the illusion of stealth finally shattered. Elias and the strike team had reached the Grand Ascent, a colossal vertical shaft housing the spire's primary anti-gravity lifts. They needed to ride the central platform directly to the broadcast hub located just beneath the High Council chambers. But as they stepped onto the massive floating disc of polished stone, a secondary security sweep, completely automated and independent of Alara's hacked network, swept the shaft. The platform bathed in a searing, violent red light. The alarm was silent, but the response was instantaneous. From the alcoves above, a swarm of elite spire guards descended. They were larger than the standard patrol drones, their armor thick and heavily reinforced, wielding long, glowing kinetic rifles that fired concentrated bursts of hyper-accelerated mass. A fierce, desperate firefight erupted on the ascending platform. The resistance fighters immediately dropped into defensive formations behind the sparse cover of the platform's control pylons. They opened fire with everything they had. Magnetic rounds sparked and ricocheted uselessly against the descending Kailari guards, barely chipping their crystalline plating. Plasma bolts scorched the air, briefly blinding the aliens but failing to penetrate their thick armor. The human weapons were failing, hopelessly outmatched by the pinnacle of extraterrestrial engineering. Elias dropped to his knees, the massive speaker rig threatening to pull him flat against the stone floor. He could not fire a weapon. His hands were entirely occupied with holding the delicate analog connections of the soundboard together. A kinetic round slammed into the control pylon inches from his head, showering him in sparks and pulverized stone. Thorn, bleeding from a grazing hit to his shoulder, yelled for the team to hold the line. They were not trying to win the gunfight. They were simply buying time. Every second they kept the Kailari pinned back was another floor the platform ascended closer to the broadcast hub. Fighters stepped out of cover, absorbing lethal hits just to draw fire away from Elias. It was a brutal, agonizing display of human sacrifice. They were throwing their fragile bodies against an indestructible wall of crystal and light, fueled by a love for their world that no alien algorithm could ever quantify. Alara watched the thermal signatures extinguishing one by one on her monitor, her azure glow dimming with a profound, uncharacteristic sorrow. She frantically rerouted auxiliary power to the platform's ascent engines, pushing the anti-gravity lift to its absolute maximum velocity. Above them, Valen finally lost his patience with Maya's relentless sarcasm. The holographic text vanished, replaced by a single flashing red symbol of execution. He turned his back on her, signaling for his personal guards to prepare the lethal neural shock protocol. Maya stopped laughing. She looked at the flashing red light, her heart hammering a final desperate rhythm against her ribs. She wondered if Elias had made it, if the silence was finally about to break. The ascending platform violently slammed into the receiving docks of the broadcast hub. Only Elias and 6 heavily wounded fighters remained standing. The massive gold-plated doors of the Planetary Communications Center loomed before them, sealed tight. Behind them, dozens of Spire guards were landing on the platform, their kinetic rifles raised for the execution. The air was thick with the smell of ozone, blood, and burning wiring. Elias stared at the sealed doors, his fingers hovering over the master power switch of his speaker rig, knowing that if he could not breach that room in the next 10 seconds, the eradication of humanity would begin perfectly on schedule. A locked door at the end of the world is only an obstacle if you care about the hinges. For Elias, the golden gates of the Kailari Communications Hub were just a drumskin waiting to be struck. Elias twisted a heavy dial on his chest piece, routing a raw, unrefined burst of electrical feedback from the Kailari power cells directly into the forward-facing subwoofers strapped to his torso. He pressed the heavy black cones flush against the ornate, towering doors. The resulting kinetic punch was invisible but absolutely devastating. The solid metal buckled inwards, tearing the alien locking mechanisms apart with a violent groan of stressed steel. The heavy doors blew inward, revealing the vast pulsating heart of the alien planetary network. Behind him, Thorn and the 5 remaining fighters threw themselves into the breach, turning the shattered doorway into a desperate choke point. The ascending platform was swarming with Spire guards, their kinetic rifles illuminating the vertical shaft with lethal blue flashes. Thorn ordered his team to empty their magazines and hold the line. They did not need to survive the next 10 minutes. They only needed to survive the next 10 seconds. Miles above, in the sterile silence of the command pinnacle, Overseer Valen raised his hand. His internal processors had confirmed the authorization codes from the High Council. He initiated the final sequence for the global eradication protocol. A holographic globe of Earth materialized before him, bathing the observation deck in a cold, crimson glow, displaying the orbital platforms aligning their apocalyptic payloads. With a secondary dismissive gesture, he signaled his personal guards to execute the human prisoner. The guards aimed their neural shock rods at Maya, the tips glowing with a lethal, condensed white energy. Maya braced against the invisible stasis field, her eyes fixed entirely on the ceiling, refusing to give the alien overseer the satisfaction of her fear. The orbital strike command was buffering in the central network, a digital death sentence racing down the Spire's nervous system. Would the signal reach the orbital platforms before Elias could hijack the network? Elias charged into the center of the broadcast hub. The chamber was a cathedral of pure information, dominated by a towering central transmission pillar made of perfectly clear, humming crystal. Millions of delicate fiber optic threads branched out from its base, routing every pulse of light and subsonic tremor across the globe. Elias slammed his heavy exoskeleton rig onto the floor beside the pillar. He drew a jagged survival knife and began violently stripping the thick rubber insulation from his primary audio cables. Connecting analog copper wire to an alien light-based router was a theoretical nightmare. Ilara had provided the technical schematics, but theory meant nothing when kinetic rounds were scorching the air inches above his head. Elias grabbed the raw, sparking bundles of copper wire. He located the primary data intake port at the base of the crystal pillar. a smooth, vibrating indentation designed to receive subsonic telemetry. Elias jammed the live copper wires directly into the alien port. The Kailari system instantly and violently rejected the crude, high-voltage electrical current. Searing arcs of blue lightning lashed out, wrapping around Elias's forearms and burning his skin. He let out a ragged cry, his muscles locking up from the intense electric shock, but he refused to let go. He forced the wires deeper into the crystal matrix, overriding the delicate light pulse receptors with raw, dirty, human voltage. With his free hand, he reached for the digital archive console mounted to his speaker rig. He bypassed the classical symphonies. He bypassed the jazz and the pop sections. He selected a legendary ancient track of pure, unadulterated, speaker-blowing heavy metal. A ferociously aggressive tempo layered over a punishing, earth-shaking bass drop designed to incite absolute chaos. He grabbed the master volume dial, twisted it to the absolute maximum, and physically snapped the plastic knob off the board. He hit play. The music kicked in. There was no gradual build-up, no gentle acoustic fade. A colossal physical wall of kinetic energy erupted from the central transmission pillar. The crystal matrix, engineered to amplify gentle pulses of light across thousands of miles, was suddenly forced to broadcast the raw, violent, seismic force of a heavy bass drop at the speed of light to every spire, every sensor node, and every Kailari receiver on the planet. The shockwave was invisible, but its effects were apocalyptic. In the doorway of the broadcast hub, the charging spire guards froze in mid-stride. The intense, aggressive, low-frequency vibrations struck the fatal resonant pitch of their biology and their technology simultaneously. Their kinetic rifles simply disintegrated in their hands. The heavily reinforced crystalline armor covering their massive bodies spider-webbed with jagged cracks. Within a fraction of a second, the armor violently detonated outward in a cloud of pale dust. The aliens collapsed to the stone floor, clutching their heads in silent, absolute agony. Their delicate nervous systems completely overwhelmed by the sensory onslaught of down-tuned electric guitars and rapid-fire kick drums. Thorn and the surviving resistance fighters lowered their empty weapons, staring in stunned disbelief as the invincible alien strike force dissolved into writhing piles of shattered glass. The deafening, distorted music roared through the chamber, vibrating their teeth and shaking the blood in their veins. At the very top of the spire, the executioners standing over Maya abruptly dropped their lethal shock rods. The invisible shockwave ripped through the floor plates. Their armor fractured and crumbled, leaving them paralyzed and gasping for a breath they could not catch. Overseer Valen, the absolute pinnacle of cold, frictionless logic, experienced a sensation his species had never calculated. Pure, incapacitating pain. The overwhelming bass frequencies tore through his thick amethyst plating. The perfectly ordered crystalline structure of his body betrayed him. His bioluminescence, usually a calm and controlled language of light, flared into a blinding, chaotic white starburst, then short-circuited entirely. His internal gravity dampeners failed. Valen crashed heavily to his knees, his hands slamming against the floor as his entire biological framework began to vibrate apart. The stasis field holding Maya instantly dissipated. She dropped to the cold obsidian tiles, taking a ragged, desperate breath. She pushed herself up onto her elbows, swiping her blood-matted hair out of her eyes. She felt the familiar, deeply aggressive thumping of a heavy rock anthem vibrating violently through the floor, a rhythm that resonated deep within her own chest. She looked at the incapacitated, trembling form of the alien overseer and let out a breathless, triumphant laugh. The music was tearing the spire apart from the inside out, ripping through the planet-wide network and turning every piece of Kailari technology into a localized sonic bomb. But as the holographic red globe continued to glitch and spark above Valen's fallen body, A terrifying question remained. The music was playing, but had the orbital strike command been permanently aborted? Or was it merely delayed by the planetary system failure? A revolution rarely starts with a single spark. Sometimes it begins with a heavy metal power cord that shatters the sky. The corrupted signal emanating from the central spire did not just break the silence of the alien occupation. It ignited a dormant, explosive fire across the entire globe. Down in the dirt, the smog, and the sprawling labor camps, the human race felt the bass long before they registered the melody. In the suffocating extraction zones of Neo-Tokyo, across the scorched, strip-mined quarries of Eastern Europe, and within the subterranean transit lines of Sector 4, the invisible shockwave hit the Kailari overseers simultaneously. The towering crystalline wardens froze mid-stride. Their armor, designed to withstand intense kinetic impacts and thermal blasts, instantly spider-webbed with millions of microscopic fractures. Within seconds, the invincible enforcers collapsed to the ground, their rigid plating detonating outward in localized clouds of pale, glittering dust. For a brief, suspended moment, the human laborers simply stared at their fallen captors, their minds struggling to process the sudden, violent collapse of their invincible gods. Then the relentless, aggressive rhythm of the electric guitar washed over them, vibrating through the soles of their boots and rattling their teeth. They understood. The resistance had actually done it. The fear that had kept humanity docile for years evaporated in a single heartbeat, replaced by a soaring, euphoric rage. From hidden compartments beneath rusted floorboards, from deep within hollowed-out concrete pylons, and from the buried vaults of forgotten cities, the laborers retrieved their contraband, archaic boomboxes, hastily repaired amplifiers, and massive jury-rigged public address systems were dragged into the open air and wired directly into the failing Kailari power grids. They cranked the volume dials until the plastic knobs broke off, catching the broadcast signal from the spire and amplifying it a millionfold. Where they lacked surviving electronics, they used pure, kinetic brute force. Scavengers beat heavy steel pipes against empty fuel drums. Mechanics revved the unmuffled engines of hidden combustion vehicles, and thousands of voices screamed in raw, unadulterated defiance, creating a thunderous, chaotic symphony of survival. The planet itself had been transformed into a colossal instrument of war. The Kailari military and political infrastructure completely dissolved within a matter of hours. Their sleek, gravity-defying ore transports spiraled out of the sky, their delicate internal gyroscopes shattered by the relentless sonic barrage, crashing into the wastelands harmlessly away from the human settlements. Automated defensive turrets sparked and died, their sensory nodes overwhelmed by the chaotic frequencies. Elite patrol squadrons were neutralized entirely, trapped in a paralyzing sensory overload that rendered their advanced weaponry useless. The very technology that had enslaved a world was now an inescapable prison of agonizing vibration for its creators. Inside the central spire, the architecture was screaming. Elias sprinted through the trembling, polished obsidian corridors of the upper echelons. He had left Thorn and the surviving fighters to fortify the broadcast hub, his only remaining objective pulling him violently toward the apex. The pristine halls were littered with the writhing, incapacitated forms of the spire guards, their weapons abandoned, their armor crumbling like dry clay. Elias stepped right over them, his heavy boots ringing against the floor. He was entirely immune to the invisible storm tearing the alien empire apart, fueled purely by adrenaline and a desperate need to find Maya. He reached the heavy doors of the command pinnacle and shoved them open with his shoulder. The room was bathed in the harsh, flickering light of short-circuiting Kailari consoles. The massive red holographic globe, the terrible indicator of the orbital strike, was glitching wildly, the eradication command permanently locked in a corrupted buffering loop. In the center of the vast chamber, Overseer Valen lay broken, His once magnificent amethyst armor was reduced to a jagged, ruined shell. The absolute pinnacle of alien logic was reduced to a shivering, helpless mass, entirely unable to compute how a species so disorganized could weaponize an atmospheric disturbance. Standing over the fallen overseer, battered, bleeding, but fiercely unbroken, was Maya. Elias dropped his scavenged magnetic rifle. It hit the floor with a heavy clatter that was instantly swallowed by the roaring music. Maya turned, her eyes widening as she saw him through the haze of electrical smoke and pulverized crystal. They ran to each other, colliding in a desperate, bruising embrace. It was a passionate, triumphant reunion, an anchor of profound human connection amidst the deafening roar of their impossible victory. Elias buried his face in her shoulder, feeling the rapid, steady thrum of her heartbeat against his chest, a rhythm infinitely more beautiful than the heavy metal tearing the spire apart. They had survived the end of the world, and they had done it together, high above them, sequestered in the relative safety of the archival vaults. Ilara stood amidst the cascading failure of her civilization. She had anticipated the devastating effect of the resonant frequencies and had painstakingly modified her own azure plating over the past 2 days. Lining her internal crystalline structures with scavenged human acoustic dampeners, the music washed over her as an intense kinetic pressure, deeply uncomfortable but entirely survivable. She watched the telemetry data flood her monitors. The surface occupation was unequivocally defeated. Her people were incapacitated, their logic engines failing against the chaotic tide of human emotion and sound. Moving with swift, practiced precision, Ilara accessed the primary interstellar communication array. She forcefully bypassed the corrupted planetary network and aimed the spire's heavy transmission dish directly at the massive Kailari fleet hovering in high orbit. She transmitted a powerful, pulsing sequence of azure bioluminescence, translating her urgent demands into the pure, frictionless language of light. It was a message of unconditional surrender. She formally declared that the planet Earth was utterly unconquerable and highly toxic to their biology. She exposed Overseer Valen's unsanctioned, illogical eradication attempt, painting him as a mathematical failure who had drastically miscalculated the human variable. Finally, she presented herself not as an archivist, but as the new pragmatic voice of their surviving people on the surface, demanding an immediate cessation of all hostilities to prevent the complete extinction of the Kailari ground forces. The massive dark warships in orbit received the transmission. Their advanced tactical algorithms struggled to process the sudden, catastrophic defeat of a planetary garrison by a disorganized mammalian workforce. The fleet halted its bombardment sequence, the glowing weapons ports on the undersides of their hulls slowly dimming as they hung motionless in the cold void of space. Yet, a terrifying tension remained. The Armada had stopped its attack, but it had not retreated. They lingered in the upper atmosphere, a looming shadow over the victorious, the screaming planet below. Elias and Maya stood at the observation window of the spire, looking out over a city illuminated by the fires of rebellion, wondering if the Kailari commanders would accept the logic of a lowly archivist, or if they would risk their own violent destruction by descending into the deafening, lethal noise of a liberated Earth. The hardest part of surviving an apocalypse is figuring out what to do with the shattered pieces of the gods who tried to end it. For the colossal Kailari Armada suspended in the freezing exosphere above Earth, the brutal mathematics of survival finally outweighed the cold logic of their conquest. The dark obsidian warships hung motionless against the stars, their advanced tactical algorithms choking on the data Ilara had transmitted from the surface. The High Command watched the telemetry of their invincible planetary garrison dissolving into dust, entirely incapacitated by a localized atmospheric disturbance they could neither perceive nor defend against. Ilara's azure bioluminescence painted a stark, undeniable picture of failure. Overseer Valen had drastically miscalculated the human variable, turning a docile labor force into a planet-wide sonic weapon. To descend into the atmosphere now would mean subjecting their delicate crystalline structures to the same lethal, chaotic frequencies that had already crippled their finest warriors. It was a mathematical certainty of total annihilation. With a series of slow, magnificent maneuvers, the massive ships extinguished their targeting arrays. They severed their digital tethers to the planetary network, turned their colossal prows away from the blue marble, and silently slipped back into the deep void of space. The occupation was over. They abandoned their broken empire, leaving behind a world that was simply too loud to conquer. Down on the surface, the adrenaline of the uprising began to settle into the exhausting, triumphant reality of liberation. The smog-choked skies slowly began to clear as the resistance forces systematically dismantled the Kailari atmospheric processors, allowing genuine sunlight to touch the streets of Sector 4 for the first time in years. The immediate aftermath was a bizarre, fragile dance of geopolitical realignment. The human race was entirely back in control, but they were now the custodians of thousands of stranded, severely traumatized Kailari survivors. Ilara emerged as the vital bridge between two entirely incompatible species. She descended from the archival vaults of the central spire, her glowing azure armor heavily modified with scavenged human technology. Elias had spent hours meticulously outfitting her with thick, rubberized acoustic dampeners and heavy industrial soundproofing foam, creating a bulky but effective layer of insulation against the ambient noise of a liberated human city. She looked entirely absurd, a sleek alien archivist wrapped in the remnants of a recording studio. But the crude human engineering saved her life. Under her guidance, the humans began the strange, deeply ironic process of nursing their former overlords back to health. The hyper-advanced, intensely logical beings who had viewed humanity as a primitive biological resource were now entirely dependent on the grease-stained mechanics they had enslaved. Overseer Valen, stripped of his authority and his shattered amethyst armor held together by heavy-duty duct tape and synthetic resin, found himself confined to a specialized, soundproofed medical bay deep within the subterranean reservoir. Every time a human dropped a wrench or a heavy steel door clanged shut in the distance, the former tyrant flinched, his once flawless bioluminescence flickering with an entirely new, uncalculated emotion: fear. Maya frequently visited his holding cell, offering him a wide, knowing grin and a fresh bowl of synthetic rations, taking profound, humorous delight in the fact that the universe's most terrifying conqueror was now deathly afraid of a sudden sneeze. Elias and Ilara worked side by side in the massive ruined broadcast hub, dismantling the weaponized speaker rig and studying the intricate alien fiber optic network. Ilara taught him the frictionless language of light and crystal, while Elias explained the chaotic, soulful mathematics of audio engineering. They were reverse engineering the spire, turning a monument of oppression into a beacon of shared knowledge. The Kailari had to learn that true efficiency was not found in absolute silence or rigid adherence to logic, but in the flexible, resilient power of adaptation. This was the profound moral reflection that settled over the rebuilding world. The Kailari had scanned humanity and measured our worth entirely by our physical strength and our capacity for ordered, frictionless production. They had looked at our art, our music, our desperate need to express the turbulent oceans of emotion within us, and they had categorized it as a useless, chaotic waste of energy. They failed to understand that rigidity is ultimately brittle. A structure built solely on cold, unyielding logic will inevitably shatter under the right kind of pressure. Humanity's greatest strength was the very thing the Kailari sought to eradicate: our passion, our grief, our wild, syncopated rhythms, and our ability to take raw, messy emotion and forge it into an invisible, kinetic force. We were not weak. We were merely waiting for the right tempo. We fought an indestructible enemy not with lasers or kinetic bombs, but by simply refusing to be quiet. We took the trauma of occupation and channeled it through heavy copper wire, proving that a unified voice, no matter how distorted, is the most destructive and beautiful force in the galaxy. Yet, as the global comms network flickered back to life, broadcasting human voices to the stars once more, a quiet, lingering question remained. Elias stared at the deep space telemetry arrays Ilara had brought online. Now that they had turned the entire planet into a colossal amplifier, projecting their deafening song of defiance into the deep black, they had unequivocally announced their presence to the universe. The Kailari had retreated, but the galaxy was vast and dark. Who else was out there, listening to the frequencies of a world that refused to die, high above the bustling, chaotic noise of the recovering city? Elias and Maya stood shoulder to shoulder on the open observation deck of the central spire. The wind whipped past them, carrying the distant rhythmic thumping of improvised drums and the soaring electric wail of a guitar solo echoing from the streets below. It was no longer a weapon. It was a celebration. It was the messy, glorious sound of humanity reclaiming its home. Maya leaned against the obsidian railing, the bruises on her face fading, her eyes tracking the golden hues of the setting sun. She reached out and intertwined her fingers with Elias. He squeezed her hand, feeling the solid, undeniable reality of her presence. They did not need to speak. They had navigated the darkest tunnels of their world, faced down the absolute silence of extinction, and they had emerged into the light. The oppressive, frictionless order of the Kailari was gone, replaced by the beautiful, unpredictable rhythm of a second chance. They stood together, looking out over the horizon, ready to face whatever the universe dared to send them next, knowing that as long as the music played, they would never be conquered again. Thank you so much for watching this story unfold. If you enjoyed this journey into a world where human expression becomes the ultimate weapon, please make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with a friend who appreciates a great sci-fi adventure. I rely on your support to keep these stories coming, so please hit that hype button right now to help push this narrative out to more viewers who need to hear it. Drop down into the comments and leave the word resonance so I know you made it all the way to the end of the journey. Until the next transmission, stay loud and keep looking at the stars.